when you're looking for kind of correlations, right, you have variations in consciousness, variations in brain activity, and you're looking how those correlate. And one of the main ways people, I think of consciousness as varying is in some kind of level, right? Some kind of thing where you're wide awake and you're very conscious versus when you're about to fall asleep, maybe you're less conscious, and when you're anesthetized, not at all. This is an area where I'm far more sympathetic to the idea that consciousness might be more of a kind of binary phenomenon, all or nothing. But yeah, what are your thoughts on levels of consciousness?
So indeed, I think that it's important to distinguish here different kinds of correlates that one might go after, whether they're just sort of mere correlates or explanatory correlates. So we can indeed look for the correlates of what you might call global conscious level. As you say, difference between being awake and aware, or under a general anesthesia, or in a coma, or something else. Tempting to think of this as a one-dimensional thing. I think it's probably not just a single dimension. Tim Bain's written about this very nicely. So that's one type of correlate, and the other type of correlate would be the thing we started talking about, which is about conscious content. So for somebody who is conscious, they're conscious of a particular thing, and what is the correlate of that particular scene that they're experiencing at that time. Now, level and content are probably not completely independent, but they certainly lead you to do different sorts of experiments. You put people under general anesthesia in one case, and you do them something like binocular rivalry in the other case. So for conscious level, this for me, I don't really think of in the prediction machine way of thinking, at least not initially. So that it's something more to do with the global functional integrity of distributed neural networks that can be measured in various ways. So here there's lots of work going back to my old postdoctoral mentor, Gerald Edelman, and his colleague, Giulio Tononi, about the dynamical complexity of brain networks as being key to conscious level. And so for some years now, we've been working on ways to develop measures of complexity that might track conscious level in interesting ways. Whether there's an on-off, like a binary moment of transition, I'm not so sure. Again, I think there could be. It's one of these things that becomes almost a little bit semantic, right? There's again an old philosophical thought experiment or paradox, the idea of when does a pile of sand become a pile of sand, or if you take grains of sand away from a pile, when does it stop becoming a pile? There doesn't seem to be any good point to draw the line until you get down to absolutely no sand at all. So it might be something to do with consciousness. I can imagine that some things really aren't conscious at all. A table, for instance, or me when I'm dead, or hopefully me and under general anesthesia. But that really, it's sensible to think of consciousness as graded for most of the time. That the difference between no sand and one grain of sand just isn't a particularly interesting difference.
Right. I mean, my thinking on this is that what we perceive as change in conscious level is change in contents. And in your book, you said something kind of similar. You said that level kind of blurs into contents. And so, I'm coming at this from the perspective of there are particular kind of ways of meditating where you kind of identify with the witness. You see the kind of common feature of awareness in every conscious experience. And you can have this feeling that core knowingness of consciousness never changes. And there's a particular experience that you can do as you're falling asleep where you can notice that it's the self that appears within consciousness. The contents feel sleepy. Consciousness itself is wide awake. Even at the moment you fall asleep, consciousness feels completely wide awake if you can identify this, just the core knowing aspect. And that I've heard reports of meditators who claim that they maintain consciousness through deep sleep. And I'm becoming kind of increasingly sympathetic to the possibility that the bedrock of consciousness may always be there, even in general anesthesia, but the contents change. So, you go under, you lose your sense of self, your memory processing, you come back out, you feel like there was no consciousness, but perhaps there is the bare kind of lights being on with very little happening may remain throughout. Is that something you think could be occurring?
Well, I hope not in general anesthesia, I have to say. But it's not. I suppose it's impossible to rule out, though. Again, it just becomes a little bit. It's unclear what it might mean to say that there's consciousness without any content at all. There are people who, and you're right to mention the meditative tradition here, because they have notions of pure consciousness, which is in some way completely contentless consciousness. Thomas Metzinger, the German philosopher, has been writing about this much more extensively lately. Is that a particular kind of global state that we can investigate somehow? I think the kind of pure contentless consciousness that you might get in some idealized meditative situation is very different from what's happening in general anesthesia. I think subjectively and physiologically, it's completely different there. So I do think there's an everyday sense in which consciousness goes away in some conditions, such as general anesthesia and coma, in a way that's not identical to simply stripping most contents from our ongoing life. Also, one of the things that makes me think of is it's one thing that stands in the way of doing that is it's very hard to turn off the kinds of internal bodily experiences that we get. The brain is continuously engaged in regulating and perceiving and regulating its physiological state. And it could even be that in some states of external sensory deprivation or the turning down of our external perceptual awareness, actually that heightens things like bodily awareness. This certainly happens in some meditative practices where you become very aware of what's going on in the body.
Right. And you mentioned the work of Tononi and Edelman and this kind of measuring the level of consciousness by studying the brain. And there's this particular procedure they called zap and zip. I was wondering if you could share that with the audience.
Zip and zap.
Really interesting.
Yeah, so this is a really nice example of consciousness science actually being useful rather than just sort of something, hey, we'd like to understand this because it's one of the big mysteries. There's been and there remains a pressing need to be able to evaluate whether people are conscious in clinical situations. This could be in the everyday manipulation of general anesthesia. You want to know whether it's actually working for that person without overdosing them. And I think more problematically, there are people that have severe head injuries, brain trauma, and end up in conditions like the vegetative state. The vegetative state is different from coma. Coma is kind of unambiguously unconscious, although what you've just said, you might not completely agree. But the vegetative state is confusing because behaviorally, people in it go through sleep and wake cycles, but when they are awake, informally, there doesn't seem to be anybody home. They don't respond to commands, they don't make voluntary actions, eye movements seem very undirected, and so on. So it is defined as a state of wakeful unawareness. And the question then, of course, is, well, just because patients in this condition seem behaviorally unaware, does that mean they're actually unaware, or might they just be unable to express their inner consciousness through behavior? This has been a big challenge in neurology, and there are a number of methods now which try to go by brain imaging data to see whether it's possible to diagnose residual consciousness that is not publicly or behaviorally observable, and the zap and zip method is one of them. So this comes back to this idea that conscious level might broadly be associated with the complexity of neural dynamics. And by complexity here, I mean a process is complex when it sort of hits the sweet spot in between order and randomness, where there's some structure, but not complete regular boom, 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 boom order. And how do you track whether that is happening given some, let's say, brain dynamics that you might measure? Well, you can come up with mathematical constructs that actually try to detect this sweet spot. And that's actually the kind of thing that I've been doing with my colleagues here, like Adam Barrett, for many years now. Another way to do it, though, is to stimulate the brain and see what happens to the brain dynamics after you've stimulated it. It's a bit more, the idea is by perturbing something, you might get a bit more information than just by observing it passively. So what the zap and zip method involves is using a few pulses of transcranial magnetic stimulation. This is TMS. This is a way of injecting a very short, sharp burst of energy into the cortex. And then you use EEG, electroencephalography, to record the echo to that pulse, basically like banging on the brain with an electrical hammer and listening to the echo. And the idea is if the echo kind of wangs around all over the cortex, appearing here and disappearing and appearing there and so on, that's a sign that the underlying brain dynamics are in this sweet spot complex state. But if the response to the echo just stays more or less at the point of the stimulation, even if it's a large response, that indicates a lack of complexity in the underlying brain dynamics. And so this was work led by Giulio Tononi, who we've already mentioned, and his long-term collaborator Marcello Massimini, and now many others as well. And they showed this first nearly 15 years ago in healthy people, that you could distinguish between wake and sleep this way. But now the method has been refined so it actually gives you a number. And this is super cool. Like, you have a number. It's like a consciousness-ometer. And there's increasing evidence that this number gives useful clinical information for people in conditions like the vegetative state. So there have been a few cases where people in that state have appeared outwardly to be unresponsive, but they show the number is called the Perturbation Complexity Index. So they show a PCI value, which is the same kind of value you might get for a healthy control. And in these cases, these are the kind of people that tend to do better and recover, or maybe actually they are already conscious even at the time, which you can figure out in other ways. But the take-home message here for me is like, it's really lovely to see a very theoretically principled measure of conscious level have some traction in the lab and in the clinic.
Right. And the name zap and zip, right, is it right? It comes from, obviously you're zapping the brain, but then the same way we zip kind of files on a computer is to remove redundancy. And if something's more complex, there's less redundancy. So you can use the same algorithm to quantify complexity. Is that a fair summary?
Absolutely. That's a very fair summary. That's exactly right. It's the same algorithm that zips your digital photos into JPEGs, give or take.
And you've also developed a kind of measure of algorithmic complexity, right, that you can use to study just spontaneous activity in the brain, just doing the zip part without the zap. And is it right that you found that this as a measure of conscious level, it increases under psychedelics like psilocybin, LSD, and ketamine, which I think you said in the book hadn't been observed in any other state, right? More conscious level than in normal waking consciousness.
Yeah, that's right. So we had this collaboration with the group at Imperial College London, led by Robin Carhart-Harris, where they've been collecting unique data sets of high time resolution. So this is magnetoencephalography, high time and good spatial resolution of brain dynamics in a variety of psychedelic states. Ketamine, low dose of ketamine, high dose is actually more like a dissociative anesthetic, but low doses can be quite hallucinogenic, LSD and psilocybin. And so lots of things change in the brain on psychedelics, but we were interested in whether these measures of conscious level, like, as you say, the zip part without the zap, so they didn't do the TMS zapping for these people in the psychedelic state, they just recorded the spontaneous activity. But we'd already shown that even just applying that zip algorithm, which is just basically assessing the signal diversity or randomness of brain activity. That in itself gives you a good blunt measure of level of consciousness. It goes down when you fall asleep, it goes down in general anesthesia, it's lower in things like vegetative state as well. So when we applied that same measure to psychedelic, the data sets from the psychedelic experiments, we found that they went up. So these measures were higher than baseline. Now, this does not mean that neuroscientists discover that psychedelics are a higher state of consciousness. That has so much cultural baggage to be basically meaningless. What we found was that the brain dynamics are more random in this very specific sense of being less compressible in the psychedelic state. Signal diversity goes up. What does that mean? Well, one thing it means is that, as we were talking earlier, there's no sharp distinction between conscious level and conscious contents. One way to think of the psychedelic state is that it's a wholesale change in your conscious contents. But another way to think of it is that it's such a wholesale change, basically everything seems different, that it's best thought of as a change in your global conscious state or in your conscious level. And so from that perspective, it's not so surprising that we find a measure that's usually been used to track changes in conscious level, like sleep and anesthesia, actually show some sensitivity to the psychedelic state too. And beyond that, I think it's suggestive. There's a bit of an explanatory link you can draw. So if you look at what people report about their experiences in psychedelic states, typical reports are that the perceptual contents they have are a bit more random, a bit more freewheeling, a bit more disorganized than they are when they're not on psychedelics. And so that may, in some very vague way, begin to go along with the brain dynamics being also more diverse and less predictable. And we're digging into that a lot more these days. We're looking at more sophisticated measures of information flow in the brain between different brain regions. And this is work with Lionel Barnett. And with him and our imperial collaborators, we've shown now that there is substantially less information flow between different brain regions in the brain on psychedelics than in the placebo state. And again, this applies to all the three psychedelic conditions that we looked at: ketamine, psilocybin, and LSD. So really the brain is more diverse and destabilized and the patterns of communication between brain regions are massively disrupted in the psychedelic state.
Right. And you were talking at the start about the this kind of neurophenomenology approach of Varela and Evan Thompson, where you have the experience on one side and the kind of objective correlates on the other side, and you're trying to map them together. You write in the book about your own LSD experience that you had relatively recently, I think you say. And did you find that, we've been talking about the objective correlates of the psychedelic experience. Did that give you any extra insight that you could kind of match up to this way of thinking?
It's hard to know. I don't think it didn't sort of deliver new testable hypotheses for me immediately afterwards, but it just seemed to me that like with any kind of reported experience, it's very hard to know what that is actually like. So it's a bit like going back to Thomas Nagel and what is it like to be a bat. I mean, you can say certain things that maybe echolocation might be a bit more like hearing than seeing, or touch than seeing, maybe like some sort of distal form of touch. But the kinds of experiences that people report on psychedelics are so distinctive that I thought that it's kind of necessary for me to figure out what they're like for the first person, so at least I'm not totally misunderstanding the subjective reports that people deliver. But that's in no way saying that my own personal experiences they certainly can't have been comprehensive of the range of things that people experience. They may not even have been particularly representative, but they certainly underlined a fact for me that a lot goes on and that perceptual experiences are changed in very, very deep ways and distinctive ways. And So it gave me some confidence that there's something interesting to study here and that we're on the right track.